Well, welcome to the Feast of Trumpets, everyone. In the sermon today on this Feast of Trumpets, we're going to look closely at the events of the Day of the Lord, the time when God begins to directly intervene in the affairs of this world, leading up to the setting up of God's kingdom on this planet. Now, the first three biblical festivals of Passover, unleavened bread, and Pentecost have clear, direct passages telling us about their Christian meanings in the New Testament. Now, they represent Christ's sacrifice as our Passover lamb, putting the leaven of sin out of our lives, and the first spiritual harvest of the church. Now, when we get to the latter festival, starting with today's Feast of Trumpets, followed soon after by Atonement, Tabernacles, and the 8-day festivals, the evidence for the Christian meaning of these festivals is less direct and it's more indirect. Now, that said, we have good biblical reason to believe that their meanings are prophetic and centred around Jesus Christ's second coming and the next great phase in God's plan of salvation. Now, the Apostle Paul, in telling the Greek Colossian Christians not to be worried by the criticism about how others said they were keeping the feast days or Sabbath, tells them that these days are a shadow of things to come. In other words, they foreshadow events in the future. Now, if we're looking for a future event that fits the symbolism of the Feast of Trumpets, clearly the most obvious connection is with the 7 trumpets of the book of Revelation. And what we have to keep in mind with regards to the meaning of this particular festival that we call trumpets is that it is trumpets, plural, and not just the last trumpet of the book of Revelation when Jesus Christ returns to earth. Now, the events of the end time leading up to Jesus Christ's return are revealed to us in an interesting pattern in the book of Revelation. Now, Jesus Christ is pictured before the throne of God as being the only one worthy to open a scroll that is sealed with 7 seals. Now, as he opens each seal, a specific event takes place, and there are 7 seals in all. Now, that's the 7th of those seals then opens up the 7 trumpet plagues, and when we get down to the 7th of those trumpet plagues, it further opens up what are referred to as the 7 bowls or 7 last plagues. Now, God is the owner of the earth, but for a time, the kingdoms of men control it under the sway of Satan's influence. Now, after Christ's sinless life and death and resurrection, he became worthy to take claim of his inheritance of ruling all nations. Now, the scroll that Jesus is opening in the vision of the book of Revelation may very well be the title deed of the entire earth, which only Christ is worthy of possessing. Now, before he can possess it, seals have to be broken, which symbolise traumatic events which have to take place before Jesus Christ takes possession and begins to directly rule all nations. Now, the period known as the Great Tribulation, as referred to in Matthew 24, lasts for 3.5 years. Now, this length of time is mentioned in Revelation 11 and 12, and also in Daniel chapter 12. Now, the final part of this 3.5 year period, when the 7 trumpet plagues occur, is a period known as the Day of the Lord. Now, we've taught that the Day of the Lord is the final year of this 3.5 year period that we collectively refer to as the Great Tribulation. Now, you may have wondered, where do we get that figure of 1 year from for the Day of the Lord? Well, it actually comes from Isaiah 34 and verse 8, where we read the following: "For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompense for the controversy of Zion." Now, there are other places where we see this principle of a day for a year used in relation to other prophetic events. Now, in my message today, we're going to look into the what, and then we're going to look into a little bit about the how these events might take place before we look into the why these events will take place and what our attitude should be to the Day of the Lord. But before we look at the day of the Lord, let's do a quick review of the events that will lead up to the day of the Lord. Now, the first seals of the book of Revelation are known as the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because in vision, John sees them as riding a different coloured horse. Now, back in the old worldwide days, someone actually requested our booklet on this particular topic and mistakenly referred to them as the four horsemen of Acapulco. Now, that word apocalypse conjures up images of doom and gloom, but it's merely the Greek word used for revelation, in other words, an opening. Now, the first seal is a rider on a white horse. Now, Jesus, in his Olivet prophecy in Matthew 24, gave a parallel account of the events in the book of Revelation, and his explanation is that this is a counterfeit religion that deceives many. Now, the rider looks like Christ on a white horse, as he is pictured in Revelation 19, but here he has a bow and not a sword, as in chapter 19. Now, the white horse represents false religion. Now, in particular, is that of the great false church, which will support and feed the power of the beast power of the coming united Europe. Now, the second seal is the red horse. Now, Revelation 6:4 says that the red horse takes peace from the earth. In other words, war. Now, Jesus explained this horseman by saying, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." This is referring to World War. Now, notice here, Jesus talks about different sovereign nations battling each other, kingdom against kingdom, as opposed to there being a civil war of people under a one world government, as some prophetic teachers teach. So Jesus' words here differ from that evangelical teaching. Now, the third seal, the black horse, represents great famine. So we see here in Revelation 6 that food prices are very high because food is scarce. Now, famine often follows in the wake of war. Now, the fourth seal, the pale or sickly horse, represents disease. Now, great disease epidemics will sweep around the world in the wake of the terrible wars which often lead to such things as disease and famine. Now, even now, there are far more deadly diseases on this planet than the coronavirus, such as AIDS and Ebola. And what is to come will make the current situation look like a picnic in comparison. In Revelation 6 verse 8, we are told that the combined death toll of the four horsemen will be 1/4 of the world's population, or upwards of 2 billion people. Now, let that number sink in. 2 billion deaths. That is nearly 100 times the population of Australia. Now, this unbelievable death toll of the four horsemen of up to 2 billion should be enough to prove that we are well and truly into the greatest time of trouble ever, the Great Tribulation, when they begin to ride. And we read in Revelation 12 how God will protect his church at this particular time. Now, he doesn't do this by some rapture, but by taking them to a place in the wilderness where she is nourished and protected. Now, after Satan's attempts to destroy them fail, he then goes after the rest of God's people who are not protected. Now, notice that the woman's offspring have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So it is clear that the identity of the woman at the end of this chapter is not just physical Israel, but the church. Now, Revelation 3 and verse 10 in the letter to the Philadelphian church explains the reason why God protects those saints who are protected. Now, in the letter to those of the Philadelphian church, it says, "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I will also keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who shall dwell on the earth." Now, those who are not protected may be half-hearted members who are spiritually woken up when the events of the tribulation suddenly come upon them. Now, fired up now for God, they are now prepared to totally commit to God in a Western world that is now controlled by the beast power's false religion. Now, these are the people in the firing line of the fifth seal, which is martyrdom of Christians. Now, when it comes to the kingdoms involved in the wars of the Great Tribulation, the superpower that gets most of the attention in the book of Revelation is the one called the beast. Now, the reason it is focused upon is because it will be the worldly power that God will use to punish the modern day nations descended from ancient Israel. Now, today's nation called Israel is mostly composed of Jews who descend primarily from Judah, which was only one of the 12 tribes. Now, we also believe that the descendants of the other tribes migrated to the nations of northwest Europe and include the English-speaking nations of America, Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Now, if anyone here is fairly new and not all that familiar with our teaching on this, I would encourage you to read our booklet, The United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy. Now, in another United Church of God booklet, The Final Superpower, the evidence is given showing that the beast power is a final end-time revival of the Roman Empire, a coming united Europe, which we see slowly developing with the current European Union. Now, the current EU will in future go through some radical changes by the time of the Great Tribulation. Not only will the core of Europe become a political union, but it will also become a militaristic power and will experience a religious revival. And like in centuries past, again will work closely with the great Roman Church. Now, this is a far cry from today's EU, which is very socialist and atheistic. Now, at the end of Daniel 11, we're given a thumbnail sketch of some of the main wars of the Great Tribulation. Now, it will begin when after being pushed or attacked by the king of the south, which is probably some Arab power, possibly by terrorist attacks, the king of the north, this coming united Europe, conquers the Middle East, including the Jewish nation called Israel, Libya and Ethiopia. Now, it is probably in the wake of this conquest of the Holy Land that there will be a showdown between Europe and the other Israelite nations, of which Europe will be the victor and conquer the United States and Britain. Now, later, Europe goes on to attack powers to the north and to the east, likely to be Russia and Asia. Now, this matches up with the fifth trumpet play, which we'll look at a little bit later. And then there will be a counterattack, which is not mentioned in this particular chapter. And finally, the beast power will meet its end in the Holy Land at the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus Christ, speaking of this final great world war, tells us in Matthew 24, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." Now, in Matthew 24 and verses 29 and 30, Jesus said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn." Now, the sign telling us that the coming of the Son of Man will soon be upon us is described as what is happening in the heavens at the time of the sixth seal, where we see the sun becoming black, the moon taking on the appearance of a blood red colour, and the stars of heaven, perhaps we're talking about meteors, falling to the earth. Now, in Revelation 6 verse 14 it says, "Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and every island was moved out of its place." So we also see an enormous earthquake happening at the same time, very similar to the earthquake that will occur at the end of the day of the Lord. Now, we read also in Joel 2 and verse 31, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord." Now, this is describing the same events of the sixth seal in Revelation 6. Now this marks the start of the day of the Lord, when the destructive events to come will be primarily from God rather than from man and Satan, and he more directly begins to humble mankind. Now the first 6 seals are described in chapter 6 of Revelation. The 7th seal is opened in chapter 8, which begins the 7 trumpet plagues, from which we see the prophetic connection with the Feast of Trumpets. Now the first 4 of those trumpets are described in chapter 8 of Revelation, and each of these events are a series of cosmic events that originate in the heavens with devastating impact on the earth. Now following on the heels of the heavenly signs of the 6th seal comes the first trumpet. In Revelation 8:7 we read, "The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and 1/3 of the trees were burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up." Now when we hear the term hail, we tend to think of ice. However, the term hail can be more broadly used than just for icy hail. Now anything else that falls from heaven, like rain and ice do, can also be referred to as hail. Now it should be obvious from this hail that causes incredible wildfires around the earth that is not just ice, but is probably a hail of meteorites falling to the earth, which were described in the 6th seal as stars falling from the heavens to the earth. Now notice one other thing in relation to this hail, that it is mingled with blood. And we'll come back to that shortly. Now with the 2nd trumpet we see a great mountain burning with fire, some large cosmic object bigger than the previous meteorites hitting one of our oceans. It says here that 1/3 of everything in the sea dies, and 1/3 of the ships are destroyed. Now at the end of the movie Deep Impact, 2 objects are threatening to hit the earth. A group of astronauts are able to destroy the larger of the 2 with a nuclear explosion, but the smaller of the 2 hits the Atlantic Ocean, causing an enormous tsunami that destroys all ships in its wake and everything around both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, including wiping out the skyscrapers of New York City, including the New York Twin Towers, which you can see in the picture there, which are no longer there. Now what will happen in our future with the 2nd trumpet will probably be quite similar to that. Now there is, however, one additional detail we should note when this object strikes one of our oceans. It says that the sea became blood. Now obviously a lot of sea creatures and people in these ships will be part of this, who died, but that probably doesn't account for all of what is intended here. Now just as we see the hail of meteors mingle with a red substance that has the appearance of blood, it is likely that this object likewise is composed of something red in appearance. Now the 3rd trumpet is another large cosmic object hitting the earth. This time it falls on the rivers of a continent. In saying that it falls on 1/3 of the rivers implies it is affecting a much larger area than where it eventually hits the earth. Now some sort of bitter material is probably streaming off this object as it hurtles towards the earth. Now might this be the same material described with the phrase mingled with blood, in referring to the hail of meteorites we saw before? Now John tells us what happens with the 4th trumpet by saying that 1/3 of the sun was struck, 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of them were darkened. 1/3 of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. Now what could this be referring to? Now one possibility is darkness caused by the smoke and fire from all the meteors that have been hitting the earth with the previous trumpet plagues. Now that's one possibility, but I don't quite find that completely satisfactory to describe all of what is going on with this trumpet plague because of the constant reference to 1/3 here. Now another possibility is a sudden rotation of the earth 60 degrees, which would be 1/3 part of a day part or the night part. Now we actually have a biblical example of something like this happening back in Hezekiah's day when God suddenly turned the earth backwards 10 degrees. Now, the account of this event in 2 Kings 20 implies that it was a reversal of something that actually happened in the days of his father, with the words by which it had gone down on the sundial of Ahaz. Now, such a sudden rotation might also help to explain the enigmatic expression in Revelation 6:14, which says that the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up. Now, there's also an interesting prophecy in Amos 8:9, which may be referring to this same fourth trumpet. Amos wrote, "And it shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord, that I will make the sun go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in broad daylight." Now, in Revelation 9, the plagues then shift from those that come from the heavens to two war offensives between the two great power blocks on the earth at this time. Now, the fifth trumpet describes a 5-month battle where metal locusts, likely referring to warplanes, attack people with something like some biochemical agent that causes great pain. Now, while there is no direct proof of this, we have traditionally connected this plague with Daniel 11:44, which talks about the king of the north going out with great fury to attack the nations that threaten them to the north and to the east, likely referring to Russia and the nations of the Far East. Now, the sixth trumpet appears to be the counterattack to this battle, as nations from the east, numbering a staggering 200 million, come back and conquer from the east. And then it says in that particular trumpet plague that 1/3 of the remaining population are killed in these trumpet plagues. The seventh trumpet then releases the 7 bowls, or the 7 last plagues, which are described in Revelation 6. Now, the first is sores on those who pledge allegiance to the church-state system of the beast power based in Europe. Then we have more blood on both the seas and the rivers. Then we have the sun becoming extra hot and scorching people, then followed by darkness, particularly focused on Europe. And the sixth of these last 7 plagues is the drying up of the Euphrates River, allowing the armies of the east to cross, and for the gathering of the armies of the beast and the east at Megiddo in northern Israel, where we get the name Armageddon from, meaning hill of Megiddo. Now, it's likely at this point when Jesus Christ returns and the two armies then unite to fight what they perceive to be a common enemy, seeing Christ as some alien invader. Now, in his book, Prophecy for Today, Edward Connor compiles a whole series of prophecies from Catholics over the centuries. Now, many of these prophecies speak about a great monarch and an angelic pastor who will bring peace, but then will have to fight the Antichrist. So by interjecting these two characters before the Antichrist, many Catholics will believe that the beast and the false prophet are the great monarch and false prophet, angelic pastor, and that Jesus Christ, who follows them, will be the Antichrist, essentially making the bad guys into the good guys and the good guy into a bad guy. Now, in Revelation 18, verse 8, in talking about the fall of Babylon, John writes, "Therefore her plagues will come in one day." Now, from this, some interpret that the last 7 plagues all happen in one day. Now, while one day may apply to the fall of Rome, I don't believe that applies to the length of the time for the last 7 plagues. Now, the movement of the armies from the east of the Euphrates to Israel itself will take several days, for example. And there is also the switch from the scorching heat of the sun to the great darkness, which will likely happen over a longer period than just a day. So I believe that these last 7 plagues will probably happen over the course of several days or even a few weeks. Now, the last plague is similar to the 6th seal, with an almighty earthquake, the greatest that the earth has ever experienced, accompanied by a massive hailstorm, again likely to be meteors. And in verses 20 to 21 it says, "Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, and great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent." Now, a talent is about 30 kilos. Now, how many of these last 7 plagues might have a cosmic origin? Now, based on what we've seen with the first 4 trumpet plagues, most of them could actually have a cosmic origin. Now, plagues 2 and 3 might be from the same mingled with blood substance of the first trumpet plague. Now, the massive torrent of cosmic objects from the first trumpet plagues, and perhaps at the end here, may cause damage to the ozone layer leading to the scorching heat that we see in one of the plagues. The smoke and fire from the torrent might also cause the darkness. And the last plague is very similar to the 6 seals' massive earthquake and the first trumpet's meteor shower. Now that we've done an overview of these plagues, let's probe a little deeper into the how of what is happening at this particular time. Now, most people tend to view the plagues of the Day of the Lord as separate, independent events with little or no relation to each other, except to punish mankind. Now, are these just random plagues, or is it possible that most of these plagues are actually connected to each other as consequences of perhaps a singular or 2 methods or agents by which God will punish mankind? Does God just arbitrarily make up what plagues to use in some sort of random way? First plague, be a hail mingled with fire. Oh, what will I try next? How about a plague of darkness? Or, so are the plagues just random? Or are they connected to one another like a kind of chain reaction? Could they, for the most part, be effects of a single or perhaps 2 agents of destruction that God is using to punish mankind? Now let's look at the plagues which talk about blood and waters turning to blood. Now, the first trumpet tells us about a fiery hailstorm that is mingled with blood. The second trumpet tells us that a great mountain burning with fire that hits the sea turns a third part of the sea into blood. So whatever this fiery mountain is, such as a great meteor, it must have a blood-red pigment if it, rather than those it kills, causes that blood we see in this plague. The second of the 7 last plagues tells us that the waters of the sea were turned into blood, and the third of the last 7 plagues also tells us the same thing, that the rivers are also turned into blood. So you'll notice here that the earth and seas becoming covered with blood or a blood-red pigment happens at least 4 times, and 5 if you include the moon appearing red at the time of the 6th seal. So this begs the question, why would God repeat this type of plague so many times if they had no relation to each other and were just independent, arbitrary plagues? Now, apart from the hailstorms, there are 2 larger objects that hit the earth and cause major destruction. That's the second and third trumpet plagues. Now, what is different and unusual about one of these objects that crash into one of the earth's oceans is that it turns the sea into a blood-red colour. Now, there appears to be a serious amount of red soil coming off this huge object that hits one of our oceans. Now, if it is red soil and dust coming off this object that causes the sea to turn red, this may go a long way to explaining a lot of the other plagues that speak of things turning into or looking like blood, such as the moon at the 6th seal. We're also told that the hail mingled with fire of the first trumpet is also mingled with blood. Now, while this red soil is not usually associated with meteors or comets, it should have a familiar ring to it. Now, a good portion of Western Australia is covered in red dust from eroded iron ore. Now, this red iron-rich soil is found in great abundance right across Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and over into Queensland. In our solar system, we also have the planet Mars, which is fully covered in red iron ore dust. Now, Venus, stripped of its super thick, hot atmosphere, is essentially one great big volcano with great red lava flows rich in iron. So might iron ore be the common link with all these plagues that speak about seas and rivers and the moon looking like blood? Now let's look at the plagues of darkness. So we see the 6th seal tells us that the sun becomes black as a sackcloth of hair. The 4th trumpet tells us that a third of the sun, moon and stars' light does not shine. And the fifth of the seven last plagues tells us that darkness covers the whole of the beast's kingdom. Again, we see a repetition of a similar plague, but wait, there's still more. Now let's also notice what accompanies the hailstorms mentioned in the book of Revelation. So as the heavenly signs of the sixth seal occur, an almighty earthquake occurs such that every mountain and island is moved out of its place, though there is probably some degree of hyperbole in that statement. Now, right on the heels of this earthquake is the first trumpet plague, which is a fiery hailstorm. This meteor shower is so destructive that a third of the Earth's vegetation is destroyed by the tremendous bushfires created by it. Now, the seven last plagues is the greatest earthquake of all time, shaking the whole earth. Now, just like at the beginning of the day of the Lord, this almighty earthquake appears to be accompanied by a tremendous hailstorm, another great meteor shower. Now, the last plague at the end of the very end of the day of the Lord appears to be identical to the combination of the sixth seal and the first trumpet at the beginning of the day of the Lord. Now, we've been given some glimpses of the sort of cosmic catastrophe described in the book of Revelation through such blockbuster movies like Deep Impact and Armageddon that came out at the end of the 1990s, which focused on cosmic events involving heavenly bodies from outer space. Now, we should keep in mind also that not always, but very often, God uses and guides natural phenomena to punish mankind. So with that in mind, what overall phenomena could possibly trigger off such catastrophic events that we see during the day of the Lord? Now, we see cosmic plagues at both the start and the end of the day of the Lord, with two war offensives in between them. Is God using two agents of destruction, one at the start, one at the end of the day of the Lord, or just one agent that makes a return at the end of the day of the Lord? Now, the more conservative the possibilities for connecting up the plagues by one or two overall agents of destruction is the Earth passing through a cometary meteor shower. Now, meteor showers are showers of cometary debris that are usually associated with a parent comet. Now, the comet Enki, for example, crosses the Earth's orbit and has an orbital period of 3.3 years and has a meteor shower train associated with it called the torids. Now, the Earth passing through meteor showers like the torids at the start and the end of the day of the Lord could be the means by which God will bring about most of the plagues of the day of the Lord. It's one possibility. Now, astronomers for a long time have pushed the view that comets are just icy snowballs, but this view is changing as we have intercepted comets with probes that have much higher resolutions, cameras, which are showing that comets are looking rocky with pits and craters, and apart from their bright tails, look no different in appearance to asteroids or meteors. Now, a new brand of science challenging the orthodox astronomy called the electric universe presents a view of astronomy where electricity plays a far greater place in space than the gravity-only model of standard astronomy. Now, one scientist from this branch of science predicted that there would be an electrical discharge when NASA landed a probe on Comet Tempel 1, contrary to the expectations of NASA. Now, his prediction was spectacularly confirmed, as seen in the bottom right photo here. Now, electricity is the movement of negative electrons. Now, like air in our atmospheres, electrons seek a balance, as per that expression used before, nature abhors a vacuum. Now, you've probably opened up a window on a stinking hot day and experienced that brief rush of wind, which soon thereafter fades away as the temperature between outside and inside becomes more even. Now, electricity acts in the same way, seeking a balance, moving from where there are atoms with too many electrons, in other words, negatively charged, to where there are too few electrons, or positively charged. Now, the electrical equivalent of that brief rush of wind is called an electrical discharge. An electrical discharge is that sudden rush of electrons that occurs when two areas of different charge meet and they try to even out the electrons between them. Now, if the difference is great enough, this balancing process can happen over quite a longer period, and we see this with comets. A comet is basically a big rock, and when it comes into the sun's electrical area of influence, we see it light up as its comet's bright tail. Now, the more radical possibility for linking up the plagues as consequences of a single agent of destruction is the near passing of a large heavenly body. Now, this is clearly the far more terrifying possibility, especially if there is a difference in electrical discharge between the two bodies. Now, on the right here, you can see a lab experiment showing what happens when two spheres of different electrical charge come near each other. Now, lightning, one form of electrical discharge, is described in relation to the events of the day of the Lord in Psalm 97, where it talks about how God's lightnings light up the world, and also in Revelation 16 when the last plague of the day of the Lord takes place. Now, let's hope that this is referring to more localised lightning than the sort of lightning I had illustrated on my last slide. Now, notice the pattern of the earlier and latter group of plagues during the day of the Lord. Now, the earlier group starts with the climax of a worldwide earthquake and meteor shower before the plagues drop off in intensity. With the latter group, the last 7 plagues, there is a growing intensity that climaxes with a worldwide earthquake and meteor shower. Now, this lowering then rising intensity is an interesting pattern. Now, one advantage of that more radical possibility of a near passing of a heavenly body is that its gravitational or electrical attraction might provide a cause for the incredible seismic activity that occurs at the start and the end of the day of the Lord. It should also be noted that because of the solar wind, the tail of any cometary body always faces away from the sun. Now, this might provide an explanation for this pattern of lowering then rising intensity that we see here. Now, in relation to this more radical possibility, it is interesting to note what ancient records tell us about the Earth's calendar in the past. Now, a month in the Hebrew calendar is the time between one new moon and the next. Now, the observable time between new moons today is 29.5 days. Now, because the time between new moons is 29.5 days, the current Hebrew calendar has alternating months of 30 and 29 days. Now, because there are about 12.4 of these monthly cycles in a year, to keep the Hebrew calendar in sync with the seasons, the Jews add in an extra month called Adar 2, 7 times in every 19 years. Now, many of the older members here may remember Mr. Armstrong making reference at times to this 19-year time cycle. Now, the additional month, 7 years in every 19 years, is why the Hebrew festivals in the Bible are a week earlier each year and then jump again to mid-October once about every 3 years. Now, this process of adding leap days, or like we do today, and leap months, as in the Hebrew calendar, is known as intercalation. Now, I've got several independent quotes which state that the intercalation was not, that this sort of intercalation was never practiced up until a few centuries before Jesus Christ. Now, here are several quotes showing that from Egypt to Babylon to Persia and India, there was a time when there were only 360 days in a year, which had 12 months of 30 days. Now, in the book of Genesis, we read that the flood lasted for 150 days, and that went from the 17th of the second month to the 17th of the 7th month. So 5 months of exactly 30 days each. So if Noah knew that the months alternated between 30 and 29 days, as they do today, then why didn't he reckon each of the months in such a way when he couldn't see the moon? Now, many Bible students are familiar with the prophetic year of 360 days in length. Now, both that and the number of 360 degrees in a circle appear to be a remnant of this ancient year of 360 days. So what these ancient sources all appear to be telling us is that we may well have had this perfect year of 360 days before something happened and we ended up with this rather imperfect and awkward calendar that we have today. Now, if this is true, I'm not being dogmatic in saying that this is true, but if this was true, just how could the Earth's orbit have been changed? What might have pushed the Earth out into a longer orbit around the sun if we really did have a shorter year at that time. And more interestingly, for current day, could we see a reversal of this back to that perfect year that we may have once had as part of the restoration of all things that's spoken of in Acts 3 and 21? Now we know that the earth will be renewed into a paradise during the kingdom of God, but God also promises a new heaven as well. What might this refer to? Now, one of several possibilities that this might refer to a change in orbits within the solar system. Now, in relation to this possibility, Isaiah 24 verse 20 says that the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard. It will fall and it will not rise again. Now, could this indicate that the earth might drop into a closer orbit to the sun and restore that perfect year that we looked at before? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, then that would also then be the question how God might bring that about. There's also an interesting millennial prophecy in Isaiah 4 and verses 4 and 5, which reads, "When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, the Lord will create above every dwelling place of Mount Zion, and above her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a covering." Now, might this possibly be a reference to the agent of destruction God uses now being turned into a blessing for mankind, perhaps? Now, a massive cometary body would be visible in broad daylight with the appearance of a pillar of cloud and smoke, and by night it would look like a flame pillar of fire. Now, when asked about what the sign of his coming would be in Matthew 24, Jesus mentions that the heavenly signs of the sixth seal, and then he says that the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven following his return. Now, might this sign be the cause and not just the effects of the sixth seal? So that's a look into the clues and the pros and cons of both the conservative and the radical possibilities for how God might bring most of the plagues of the day of the Lord about. Now, we look through a dark glass dimly, as Paul said. I'm certainly not dogmatic about any of this. We don't know for sure the means as to how God will bring these events upon mankind until they're really right upon us. Now, in an interview on the Prophecy Watchers program, Tim Mahoney, producer of the Patterns of Evidence films, makes an astute comment that according to the book of Revelation, we will see a repeating of the plagues of the Exodus in the end time. Now, we see the plagues of blood, sores on man, hail mingled with fire, and darkness all repeated at the end time. Now, prophecy is rooted in history. In order to better understand prophecy, we have to better understand the patterns of history, including any earlier fulfillments in time of those prophecies. So let's look at some further background in history from the ancient past that might shed more light into the prophecies of the day of the Lord. Now, the following quote is from an article that appeared in London's Sunday Times newspaper entitled "Meteor Showers Blotted Out Man's First Civilizations," that covers the discovery that in the early Bronze Age there were great meteor showers. Now, the article says, "A cataclysmic shower of giant meteors destroyed the great Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia and Greece by provoking a series of natural disasters. New archaeological and astronomical evidence indicates that a huge number of extraterrestrial bodies caused famine, flooding and bushfires thousands of miles wide that led to the collapse of the world's first sophisticated civilizations. British scientists have also identified at least 7 impact craters which were formed within a century of 2350 BC, which they believe may have been part of a meteor storm. Craters recently found in Argentina date from around the same period, suggesting that the Earth may have been hit by a shower of large meteors at about the same time." End of quote. Now, 2 sites on the opposite ends of the country of Turkey had ash layers that dated to about this time, and these ash layers were about 12 and 16 metres deep, respectively. Now, Claude Schaeffer, the great French archaeologist, found that there were enormous catastrophes that he found across the entire Middle East at the end of the early Bronze Age, the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and also the end of the Late Bronze Age. Now, these maps show the dozens of sites that were destroyed during the Late Bronze Age collapse, most of which were never rebuilt, where there was enormous earthquake and fire damage. Now, if anyone has seen the excellent documentary film Patterns of Evidence, you'll see that there is strong evidence to redate the Exodus from the Late Bronze Age, where it is usually dated, to the end of the Middle Bronze Age, where the archaeology matches up far better. Now, this shift in dating will also affect the dating of the other Bronze Age catastrophes that Claude Schaeffer found abundant evidence for right across the Middle East. Now, coincidentally, the shifts required to correct the conventional chronology would line up each of these destruction levels with catastrophic events recorded in the Bible, beginning with the Tower of Babel, then the Sodom and Gomorrah catastrophe, followed by the plagues of the Exodus, and the Late Bronze Age collapse lines up with the Great Earthquake of Uzziah, which itself is a type of the great earthquake to occur at the return of Jesus Christ, spoken of in Zechariah 14. Now, the last of these catastrophes at the end of the Late Bronze Age is the one that is closest to the change of year spoken of in ancient sources. Now, I remember my first reaction when it began to hit me, the sheer magnitude of these Bronze Age catastrophes that the record of archaeology was telling. I thought, if these catastrophes were that big, then what is to come during the day of the Lord will be that much bigger and more frightening, because it is prophesied to be the greatest time of destruction ever. Now, it's also interesting to note that just like in ancient Israel and Egypt, the end time Israelite nations will also be in captivity during the Great Tribulation. Now, those Israelites who repent in that captivity will be passed over or protected from the plagues that will come upon their captors, the beast power based in Europe. Now, end time Israel will also be freed from captivity by the beast power, and there will then be an exodus greater than the original exodus in Moses' day. And also, after Christ's return, Israel will fulfill its destiny as a model nation to the rest of the world, after Jesus Christ makes the new covenant with them first. They will become the first fruits of the great millennial spiritual harvest. Now, another thing that occurred at the time of the Exodus was manna falling from heaven. Now, we have some interesting historical sources outside the Bible that appear to record this event. Now, one Syrian text says, "The heavens rain oil, the wadis run with honey." And Ovid wrote of a time when there were streams of milk and streams of sweet nectar. Now, if manna fell in great quantities and fell into rivers and then melted, it would give those rivers a milky appearance. Now, this may be where the biblical expression "rivers of milk and honey" come from. Now, we read an interesting prophecy in Joel 3 verse 18, which says, "And it will come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drip with new wine, the hills shall flow with milk." Now, might this milk be a reference to melted manna, perhaps? Now, we also see that when Jesus Christ returns, that there will be also great volcanic activity on the earth, possibly set off by the other events that we have looked at so far. Now, Micah 1 says that the mountains will melt under him, and Nahum 1 says the mountains quake before him, the hills melt. Now, the grand climax of the day of the Lord is the day when Jesus Christ comes back to earth and takes control of rulership of this planet. Now, Revelation 11:15 says that this event happens at the seventh trumpet. Now, as all the last 7 plagues are a part of the seventh trumpet, Christ could return at any time during those plagues. Now, when during them is not clearly specified, though I lean towards Jesus returning at the end of those 7 trumpet plagues. Now, Zechariah 14 talks about the Lord descending upon the Mount of Olives and that the mountain splitting in two, presumably at the time of that last of the 7 last plagues, which is the great earthquake. Now, in his prophecy that was fittingly given at this very same place he will return to, Jesus said, "And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Now it's interesting that the Mount of Olives is actually a double mountain. Now you can see the church tower on the top of the main peak in this photo here. Now set back to the right of it and on the other side of a small dip or valley is the other part of that mountain. Now when Jesus comes in all his power and glory, at long last, God's kingdom will be ushered in after some resistance by the nations who will have been deceived by Satan to fight him. But as the Borg would say, resistance is futile. They will be defeated and Jesus Christ will set his hand to fix up the physical and spiritual damage done to this planet over the past 6,000 years and pour out his spirit and gradually convert the nations of the world, starting first with the modern descendants of ancient Israel. Now he won't be on his own with that task. Jesus will be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Those other kings and lords who will assist in this task of turning this planet into a physical and spiritual paradise will be you and me if we endure to the end, and all of God's saints over the last 6,000 years. At the last or the seventh trumpet, when Jesus Christ visibly returns, we will be changed from mortal to immortal. Now trumpets are blown at coronation ceremonies of kings, so it is fitting that the trumpets are blown when we are born into God's family and become kings and priests assisting Jesus Christ. Now, can you imagine what it would be at the first resurrection when we'll all be suddenly beamed up to meet Christ in the clouds? Now, all of a sudden, we will have all the emotions, all the sensory powers, and share in the vast knowledge and power of God in an instant. Suddenly, we will see all the angels that encompass us and the earth. We'll be able to hear the awesome angelic choirs and literally see Satan and the demons put into the abyss. Now there are 9 days between trumpets and atonement, so Satan might still have a few more days stirring up the nations after Christ's return before he's put into the bottomless pit and won't be able to influence mankind over the next 1,000 years. Now there's been lots of speculation as to where and when the marriage supper of the Lamb will be. Now there's quite a number of different possibilities. Now personally I lean towards it happening during that first Feast of Tabernacles. Now marriages in ancient Israel were celebrated over 7 days, so that's same length of time as the Feast of Tabernacles, so I think that personally is a good fit. Now during his Olivet prophecy describing the events of the day of the Lord, Jesus said, "Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads because your redemption draws near." Now as bad as these horrific events will be, we can rejoice in the fact that Jesus Christ's return and our redemption and part in the resurrection, first resurrection, is very close. Now the choice of the term redemption here is quite interesting. On the Day of Atonement, we tend to focus on the meaning of the second goat in the two-goat ceremony, picturing Satan being put away, but we tend not to focus on the meaning of the first goat. Now throughout the year, the blood of the sacrifices was brought to the temple and the blood was sprinkled before the veil of the Holy of Holies. Now once a year, the blood from the first goat, who pictures Jesus Christ, symbolically cleansed the temple. Now there's an interesting parallel there with those of us in the church, which is referred to as the spiritual temple. Now all throughout our lives, we have to regularly seek forgiveness for our new sins, which can be quite discouraging at times. But there is coming a time when Jesus Christ's redemptive work in us will finally be complete at the resurrection, when we will sin no more. Now coming back to the present, what should our response be to the terrifying events that will come upon this whole world? In Amos 5 verses 18 to 20 we read, "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, for what good is the day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into a house, leaned his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? Is it not very dark with no brightness in it?" Now there can be a prophetic kick and excitement when we feel we can better understand the details of the events that will happen in the future. However, when the reality fully sinks into our minds, what these events will be like, these are not pleasant events. These are horribly destructive events where there'll be a phenomenal loss of life and human carnage. Now, we are tasked to spiritually stand between the living and the dead by supporting the Ezekiel warning message of the church. There is yet to come a time of wrath on this earth. We know it's coming, and we even know how to tell it's close, and we must warn our Israelite nations and the world at large with urgency, not with complacency. Now we come to why of the day of the Lord. What is the purpose of all this destruction brought about by all these plagues? In Isaiah 13 we read, "For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place, in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger." Now verse 11 is the crux of this passage, saying that God is going to punish this world for its evil and its sin. The sins of this world are getting worse and worse, and those hardened by such sins need to know that God exists and will not tolerate such evil practices anymore. Now it goes on to say that he will halt the arrogance of the proud and the haughtiness of the terrible. They will need to recognise that they are nothing compared to our great God, who has standards and who will no longer tolerate such evil. Now make no mistake about what ruling with a rod of iron is all about. It is about dishing out what we might call hard love and punishing those who stubbornly will not obey him. Now human nature can be very stubborn at times, so stubborn that the only thing that will stop us from doing what's wrong and start doing what is right is pain and lots of it. Hence the reason Paul uses the term the severity of God in the book of Romans. Now God can be quite severe on us in the short term in order to be kind to us in the long term. Now God is not severe on us just to hurt us. Now there is a purpose in the pain to humble us and turn us back to him. Now this will be a gradual process at the start of the millennium. Now he starts with Israel, and sometime after Israel is set up in the land again, the Gentiles come against Israel, and God has to deal with that we read about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now that war of Gog and Magog will prove the point that man, even without Satan's influence, can still greatly resist God. On the other hand, that other war of Gog and Magog after the millennium, when Satan's released for a brief time, will prove the point how easy it is for man to turn against God when Satan is allowed to influence them again. Now there's an interesting bit here in Psalm 110, which starts by saying, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." Now it starts with the hard love, but when we get to verse 3, it goes on to say, "Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power." Now through the right application of corrective punishment and re-education, the people will come around and willingly serve Jesus Christ as Lord. Now there are a couple of Old Testament passages in Amos 5:3 and Isaiah 6:13 which suggest that only about 1/10 of mankind will survive the Great Tribulation in the day of the Lord. Now most of mankind will not survive the Great Tribulation. Now the process of converting that other approximate 90% of mankind who died during the Great Tribulation will continue during the Great White Throne Judgment. What they'll have done through before their death, followed by their sudden resurrection after that, will certainly take them back, humbling most. And the right application of re-education and tough love will continue as God works to turn all people back to him. We're told that the earth and the heavens will be shaken terribly at the time of the day of the Lord. We're also told that God's promises of bringing his kingdom to this earth after this time cannot be shaken. Knowing the terrifying events that will humble mankind in the future, and knowing about God's coming kingdom, Paul urges us to be more diligent in serving God with fear and reverence. The Apostle Peter also writes, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of the Lord?" So in conclusion, since we know about God's judgment to come upon this world, we should be more motivated to live a godly life so we can be there when Jesus Christ returns and he begins to reign and transforms this whole earth into a paradise. Let's make sure that we are there and a part of it.